My name is John Duong. I lead the impact investing work at the Lumina Foundation. And we have a great panel here. We're really looking forward to having this discussion. Now, some of this is going to just be spur of the moment and fly. We did a little bit of prep, but what we really want to do is just make sure that we answer the questions that you guys have. So we're going to save some time in the end to do that. But it'd be helpful to understand who's actually in the audience. Who are investors here?
Nobody wants to admit it.
Oh, one guy. All right.
Can you come down front?
Who are in the entrepreneur side? Okay, I've got a couple entrepreneurs. Who's in higher ed? Okay, and any corporates or a couple corporates?
Wow.
Okay, great. What did I miss?
K-12.
K-12. Well,
Never know.
institutions. Yeah. All right. Who did I not cover? I'd be curious. Media.
Ah.
Oh, okay, great. Put in a good word for us. So just to make sure you guys are in the right panel, this is the Credential Engine driving the connections between learning and work. So if you're not in the right panel, you feel free to run out and we won't hold it personally. What I want to do is actually introduce our panelists, and we're going to dig deeper, but it may be helpful for them to give you a sense of who they are and what they do, and then we can jump into the conversation.
Yes, good afternoon. Scott Cheney. I'm the Executive Director of Credential Engine.
I'm Tom Green. I'm the Associate Executive Director for AACRAO, which is the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers. I can say that in one breath. And I'm also the project lead for a partnership program between NASPA, which is Student Affairs, and AACRAO, funded by Lumina on creating the next generation of student records.
And I'm Jonathan Finkelstein of Credly, and we're a digital credential platform that helps make achievements, skills, and certifications visible and transparent and portable so that people can connect those skills to opportunities.
Hi there, I'm Courtney Brown. I'm Vice President of Strategic Impact at the Lumina Foundation.
So it might be helpful just to understand the organizations that you represent as well. Do you want to start by explaining what Lumina is, and then also talk about the problem or the challenge that we're trying to solve with this?
Absolutely. So Lumina Foundation is a national private foundation. We are located in Indianapolis, but as I said, we have a national mission. We want to ensure that all Americans have the ability to have an informed citizenship and participate in a global economy. And we believe the answer to that is education. So we work toward a national goal that by 2025, 60% of Americans will hold a certificate, degree, or high-quality credential beyond high school.
And what is the problem we're trying to solve here?
Okay, so in thinking about the Credential Engine and what we're going to talk about, so at Lumina, to get to that 60% by 2025, we want to ensure that everybody has a high-quality credential. In doing that, we approach the problem in many different ways, but one of the issues is the transparency of credentials. There's so many types of credentials out there, even degrees, understanding what a degree means. What does a history degree mean from this institution versus this institution? And so over the years, we have learned some lessons from our friends in Europe on degree qualifications profiles and credential frameworks, and tried to better understand what are the competencies that you need for an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree. And in doing that, we began work on something called the Credential Transparency Initiative, trying to understand all of the array of credentials. Because it's important to, when you have a credential that is of value to you, to your employer, to a provider, and so everybody needs to be able to speak the same language, or at least understand what is behind that credential. It's not enough to get a credential and then have an employer not understand what that means, so you can't actually get a job. And so the problem we're trying to solve is to ensure that there is more transparency to all of the credentials, which is, I will let my colleagues then take on where we went from that.
So Scott, why don't you explain what exactly is Credential Engine, how did it get started, and why is it important or relevant?
Yeah, so the work that Courtney was referring to, the Credential Transparency Initiative, really asked the fundamental question of, is it possible to bring transparency, to bring a common understanding of all credentials and make them comparable, searchable, discoverable, and more accessible to students, parents, counselors, employers, educators, etc. So just some context for this. We just put out our first report that is an attempt for the first time to inventory the number of credentials in the US. And we came up with a fairly conservative number of 334,000 unique credentials in the United States alone. And my friends at the Department of Defense who look at this issue a lot think that we're not even halfway to counting exactly what's out there. Our count did not, at this point, include badges because we just were not able to come up with a meaningful way yet to distinguish badges that are occupational and educational versus attendance. You know, if you go to a conference, you could get a badge for that. If you do a number of things, you could get a badge. That really doesn't have labor market value. We don't have yet counts of non-credit certificates, of unregistered apprenticeships, and other kinds of credentials. So 334,000 is really big, and it's really shocking that it's probably about half of what's actually there in the US. The marketplace in the US for education and training, Georgetown University cites about $1.2 trillion in post-secondary education and training, including what employers spend. If you throw K-12 in, it's closer to $2 trillion. So it is a massive marketplace with a very complex set of credentials. And going back to, again, what Courtney said, the inability to have a common language. If you get onto Google right now and you search for hotels in San Diego, you'd have a common language that allowed you to have an Expedia or a Travelocity or something. If you were searching for a car to buy, cars.com allows you to compare Toyotas and Fords, SUVs and sedans, hybrid versus gas. I dare you right now to hop onto Google and do a search for IT credentials in San Diego. You're going to get a long list of Google links, you know, that let you go search it, but nothing that actually lets you compare with common language because there was no common language until we came along and put together for the first time a credential description language that allows us to compare and let people search and make meaningful decisions about all of that. So we have now, working through schema.org and the World Wide Web Consortium, to have this language be adopted as the first standard for describing credentials anywhere in the world, and will let us allow for this marketplace of applications to pull this data and make it more accessible and usable by all these different populations.
Tom, you're one of the potential partners for this. Can you explain what AACRAO is, besides a long acronym?
Sure, yeah.
And how this connects to your area and how this could be helpful or not?
Absolutely. So AACRAO is a professional association that supports higher education. Our members are registrars, admissions officers, enrollment managers. We have 11,000 of them in 42 countries, most of them here in the US and many in Canada. We both produce credentials, and the registrars are the ones who certify the credentials of a student and put them forward. Admissions officers are often evaluating credentials and taking them in and trying to understand them. We describe that what we do with transcripts, which is our language in the United States for credentials, as inside baseball, right? It's a language we speak internally within higher education. The transcript is very meaningful for us inside of higher education, but once you leave higher education, that language is lost, and it's not a meaningful document or a way of communicating the credential to employers or people outside of it. For a very long time in the United States, the participation in higher education was very small. And so if you had a degree, you automatically had a certain assumption about what you knew, what you could do, et cetera. As we've expanded access in the United States to include a vast proportion of our adult population, that has changed. And so that we need to have more meaning to that. And the more meaning to that is what people actually learn in higher education, what they can actually do once they've received a degree. And so our work is to try and now produce records that instead of just counting credits and grades, actually explain what the skills and abilities are that a student would have once they earn a credential. And we're working with Credential Engine to try and marry that language together. what do those skills and abilities look like, and how do we map those into Credential Engine? On the other end, you've got employers trying to do the same, so that somewhere in there we're matching together and trying to identify the linkages between what we are outputting and what employers and others are trying to take in from that.
Great, thank you. Jonathan, with Credly, it might be helpful to explain exactly what that platform is to our audience. And is this a competitor? Is this a partner? How does this connect to your world?
Sure. So Credly is a platform that allows individuals to collect and put to use verified evidence of their achievements. Sometimes those are individual skills or competencies like workforce readiness skills, critical thinking, the kinds of things you would assume would have been bundled in, let's say, a liberal arts education, foundational skills. And then it tracks across the whole continuum up to and including degrees and summative certificates and industry-recognized certifications. We only deal in verified outcomes, so anything that's on an individual's Credly profile has been put there by a third party who assessed them in action, performing those skills or assessing that knowledge, and is willing to stand behind it and transparently describe what it is that they actually had to do to earn that achievement. So when you, and I should mention that while our social mission is focused on individuals and giving them ownership of portable, transparent, secure credentials that they can carry with them from place to place, our customers as an organization are those groups that are actually doing the issuing of credentials. There's a lot of value to an organization in writing a permanent record that's portable to the people that they serve. They can increase the visibility of their offerings. They can project their brand and what they value and care about in the world. They can better track and understand what it is that people are doing with the skills they have, identify gaps in skill areas, look for heat maps of either skills or deficiencies, and then ultimately create pathways for people both within the organizations that where they currently are, and also help create connections to next opportunities for jobs. So when we think about the role that Credential Engine is playing and CTDL, the markup language for credentials, this is, I think, well, first of all, let me answer your question directly. It's absolutely not. Scott and I are not frenemies. We're friends, for sure, because the only way that this really works at scale, this notion of having portable credentials, is when you have standards. And standards come from more than one organization. Standards come when there's cooperation among groups that are all involved in helping to tell that story of what it is that people can do. And that has to come from a group that convenes and brings minds and use cases together. So what Credential Engine is doing is helping answer one of the questions we hear all the time, which is, hey, I'm creating new credentials for my organization, or I'm taking existing credentials and making them digital. Is there any kind of common expectation about how I describe this? And there have been some early and very successful sets of standards that create the notion of interoperable badges or credentials. But what Credential Engine does, I think, is particularly noteworthy, is one, they take a much more extensive view about all of the details and the kinds of information that go into being able to trust the validity and understand what a credential is all about, a very deep set of metadata. The second thing is it's creating a markup language that improves discoverability of credentials. Scott gave the great example of things like travel sites and being able to bring together flights and travel information. I think of the role that the markup language, that the credential transparency description language will play is much like what RSS was back 10, 15 years ago when we take for granted now the idea that you can see all of your news sites aggregated on a single page, Google News, or if you follow any particular blogs or podcasts, have information from lots of places showing up in one consolidated, tailored view. And by having a markup language for credentials, I think we open up the ability to pull data and make more meaningful comparisons and surface opportunities for people in a more consistent way.
Great.
John, can I just follow up on something that Jonathan said, which is the idea of this markup language, the Credential Transparency Description Language, or CTDL, is not something that we, just a Credential Engine, the small staff of us who came up with this. This has been a 4-year process and an ongoing process with advisory groups and expert panels and real technical experts in schema to make sure that we're describing credentials in ways that work for the business community, educators, certification bodies, licensing bodies, quality assurance bodies, You name it, we have had so many people who've been involved with the discussion about what the CTDL should address, how you describe these things, how to make sure that when you actually translate it into the web-based schema, that you don't lose the fidelity to the on-the-ground reality that you're trying to describe for students and educators. So this has been a very open, very consensus-based process. The standard, the CTDL is live, it's out there, it's an open standard. Anyone can actually go use it now and never work with Credential Engine or anything else. We hope that's not the case. But it is an open standard, and we want that to be used in order to do exactly what everyone up here has said. Make sure that when you're talking about credentials, there is assurance from all users that this is what we mean, and you can actually begin to build the applications and the search tools and that kind of track record of what people have and what you've offered with confidence. And that's really the fundamental mission of what we're up to.
So Scott, the Credential Engine is a nonprofit.
Correct.
Right?
We see ourselves as really a public service nonprofit.
Okay. You had referenced the example that parallels it as kayak in the search for travel. The structure as a nonprofit, why hasn't somebody else done it as a for-profit? Is I guess the first part of the question. And if you're a nonprofit, how do you scale? How do you make this accepted and permeate in the market compared to a traditional social entrepreneur that might be around here?
Yeah, it's a couple of great questions. So we established ourselves as a nonprofit really with the intention of very clearly signaling that we are not trying to capture and corner a market. As a public service nonprofit, we believe that there is a tremendous public good to having this kind of transparent data about credentials that can then be put to use by all sorts of different partner organizations, whether it's states, departments of education, Credly, AACRAO, the National Association of Manufacturers, the Urban League, YMCA, you name it. This data should be able to get pulled by all these different partners and organizations and presented with a confidence that you can rely on. If Expedia says that you're sleeping in a king-size bed, you're going to get the same information if it's Trivago or Hotels.com. That's a king-size bed, right? And there is a doubt that can be raised if a for-profit is saying that, are they somehow skewing data? So we just decided the best thing we can do for the market is be a nonprofit. Why didn't other for-profits get to it? We asked the same question. We've actually had a few market analysis companies looking at the industry and looking at the market. And I think they all said, look, this has been on some radars of some for-profits. They hadn't gotten to it. Technologically, is it doable? Yes, we're proving it's doable. They hadn't gotten to it. And now you go back and talk to those same for-profits, and I've not had anyone say to me, stop doing it, we want to do it. Everyone has said, please go do it, please go be successful, because we as a for-profit, and you can name all the for-profits you can think of, actually are better positioned in the market delivering information that we can point back to from a nonprofit that is a reliable source, that everybody knows that when we say it, we're not making it up and suggesting that we're skewing data. So we benefit as a for-profit if nonprofit Credential Engine is successful doing what they're doing. And then the scaling question, right now Lumina has been our longest term, our biggest funder. Apparently someday that spigot's going to turn off. I don't know why. So we are looking into, how can we establish the business models necessary, whether it's through revenue sharing with some of the big vendors who would want to pull data, whether it's contracts with states so we can help manage data, whether it's contracts with institutions or others. We've got a couple of years still as we're kind of working through that process to figure that out. I will say here, our mission is to never have a fee barrier to publishing data. We want to have all data published by all providers of all credentials, and a fee would actually minimize that and undermine our mission of transparency. And we'll never have a fee barrier that will prevent a low-income 17-year-old, a laid-off worker from a factory, a veteran coming out, there'll never be a fee barrier that prevents them from being able to access information, whether it's through our own site or whether it's through a nonprofit. There'll be sites that are working with us for commercial purposes that we'll work out some arrangements with, but I never want to prevent someone from being able to get this data to improve their own career pathway because of a fee.
Great. You know, the value of this platform is the credentials that ultimately get into it. How do you ensure that people are willing to put their credentials into the system, or issuers are willing to do that? Tom, do you want to take that first?
Sure. So, and just to follow on to what he said on the nonprofit status, it was easier for higher ed to get in with a nonprofit. It's not impossible by any means. We have for-profit partners all the time, but it made it easier, and I think that's accelerated the work and helped. Higher ed tends to work on the peer principle. If somebody else does it, I want it, right? So if I can talk a few people into putting their credentials in, then all of a sudden some other people want to put their credentials in. And so we had to start with that incentive. I think the greatest barrier to that for us is defining the learning outcomes of the degrees in order to be able to put the data into the engine. And that's a great deal of work that we're trying to foster in our part of this, but also just for higher education in general. Learning outcomes are there. All the accreditors require learning outcomes, but they're squirreled away, and the data is often far removed from any way that we can transmit that in some type of coherent sense into something else. And so that's a great deal of the work that we have to do. Before we can put it into the engine, we ourselves have to define it and then summarize it in a way that makes sense to others.
The other aspect of not just the actual credentials that go in there, but the quality. How do you define quality of these credentials? Anyone can take this. You want to start, Courtney?
So I'll start. So at Lumina, I said we've only counted degrees and certificates up to this point because we are not confident in the quality of other credentials. Our definition of quality, a high quality credential, is one that has transparent learning outcomes and it leads to employment and further learning, has the ability to lead to both of those things. And as I'm listening, I've heard this hotel analogy a number of times and think about it. And we know so much when we're going to book a hotel room. And if I don't get what I've been promised, so Tom was just talking about being next to the train tracks, and so he could complain. It didn't, I'm here and I want a different room. How many people, when they decided to attend, I'm assuming the majority of you went to a college, probably for 4 years in brick buildings. How many of you, before you went in, knew what you were going to learn and had some competencies listed and said, here are the things, and then 6 weeks in went and said, you know what, like you said I was going to get these things and I'm not getting these things, I want my money back. Like nobody can do that. So this opens up the transparency and the learning outcomes, and these are the things that everyone should have access to. And by having access to what a credential means, it opens up the pathways to further education, because as a provider, I can say, I see these are the things that you have from this credential. As an employer, then I can also say, here are the things that credential provides and what you're able to do. And so I can be assured of that quality. So the Credential Engine is really opening up that ability. It's early in, how long now? 1 year?
We
18
actually launched in December of last year. We
Right.
came out of the pilot and launched in December.
So the amount that they've already accomplished in a short time, and then the place they can still go is amazing. And it's really going to help open up the what credentials mean for everybody, and really ensure that they're high quality, and that more Americans, more people in the world, right now it's focused in the US, but who knows?
We're going global.
Will have access to understanding and being able to look and find the credentials they need.
Great. Anybody else want to tackle that one?
I'll just briefly, I mean, for us it's easy, right? Because we already have an approval process for credentials. Oftentimes, even to operate, we have to have state approval. We have to have accreditation, regional accreditation, or professional accreditation. So those are the standards by which we can define our credentials. But we do have more than most people think in higher education, and we have a number of diplomas and certificates that are short course type of credentials. And if you think about the higher education or post-secondary landscape as including vocational education as well, there are a lot of the credentials out there that community colleges provide and technical colleges provide in things like welding, those type of things that are extremely valuable today that really most people don't tend to think about in the higher education landscape. But those are all part of what we're trying to get incentivize and get people to put into the engine so that they can be better discovered.
John, I would just add one thing to this. I think that the act of having something like Credential Engine and the CTDL and the act of creating credentials in digital form to begin with actually is having an impact on the overall quality of credentials itself. We're forcing a rethinking about what our outcomes look like. Once you have to make them more transparent, once the expectation is that they be more transparent, people recognize, organizations recognize that they are, these credentials are representative of their organizations. There's a tremendous amount of self-policing going on. I think when badges were in their earliest days 5 or 6 years ago, there was pretty much of a wild west of groups experimenting and trying different things. Do we want to recognize, as Scott said, participation? Do we want this to be something that is a summative outcome that has many stacked levels of achievements before you actually get a credential? But it's forced not just a backwards design thinking about what should go into the credential, but in the last couple of years, a special focus on what will the credential unlock for someone who owns it, in a way that I don't think most programs that have developed training, assessments, learning have had to do or have done before. But the visibility of these credentials, the fact that savvy consumers can shop and compare, and increasingly will be able to do so with tools like the Credential Engine, it means that there's a much greater attention being paid to what the institution is willing to stand behind. So I see lots of groups create governance structures for thinking about what will go out in public with a new kind of credential, and more thinking going into existing credentials where they took for granted before. Well, everyone knows you need you need your particular certification or a particular certificate to practice in our field. Well, what does it really mean, and how do we increase the awareness of what those skills actually are, and not take it for granted like we may have done traditionally? So the system itself is improving quality, I think.
Because we're trying to convey those measures of quality, and we've got the AACRAOs and foundations and the Business Roundtable and the U.S. Chamber and AACC and ACE and others who are all kind of pushing this, and a number of states are partnering with us. The benefit that we foresee is that, let's say you've got that 17-year-old who is being marketed to by a great community college, a really good apprenticeship program, and something else. Provides credentials, we don't really know what it is, but they've got great marketing material, and it really intrigues that student. If you can go on to Credential Engine or any one of our partners and look and see the information about 2 of those 3, and that third one either isn't there, or it's there, but it clearly doesn't have the kind of quality measures, you hopefully are helping that student make a more informed decision about, why am I thinking about this one when it either isn't being shown up in this application, and I can kind of question why it's not there, at least I know to question that, or it is there and I can see that the data is not as strong and the indicators are not as strong, I should maybe think about going to one of these other programs, because our goal is to get every credential in. I say the good, the bad, and the ugly, because the 17-year-old does not know the difference between the good, the bad, and the ugly unless we help them see the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the good, the bad, and the ugly are out there. They are marketing, they're in the marketplace. And we want to make sure we reveal that marketplace in meaningful ways. And so we have to have it all in, but with quality indicators that let people make those informed decisions.
In terms of the quality indicators, how do you balance, especially today, there's more and more industries issuing their own credentials for competencies that learning can take place within the workforce. It doesn't have to be within the higher ed institution. It could also be in the military. So as more and more of these credentials being issued by non-traditional issuers, how do you connect the two? You guys want to take that?
Yeah. Jonathan,
Sure, yeah, there's some really great and emerging examples of this. So once you bring transparency to the outcomes that your organization assesses and stands behind, it's much easier to look around and see, well, who else has compatible pathways, compatible opportunities, where places we might take the outcomes and allow the people who are going through our programs and connect them with an on-ramp into some other learning experience or to some job. I think again, this is one of the things where starting early with standards brings unlikely partners to the table who previously may not have been able to figure out a way of actually transacting with each other and working together. But you're defining a currency that makes it easier to say, okay, I've got 5 pennies over here, that should equal a nickel over here. Let's do the handoff, because you can actually see what the composite skills are, what the composite competencies are. So some good examples of would be, for example, the work going on at Northeastern University. Northeastern has said, we've got some great programs, including programs in data science. Hey, look over there, IBM has issued 400,000 has issued badges to over 400,000 people, over 700,000 outcomes recognized. Some of those clearly have a connection to what we offer in our degree-based programs, and sure enough, did a comparison of the skills resonant in those credentials, and have created a pathway for IBM employees and anyone earning IBM badges to save as much as a third or more of the cost of an education of attaining one of those degrees. Another example would be the work that's going on with ACE Credit. ACE, the American Council on Education, has long had a program to review workforce training, company-based training for its equivalents to college credit, to try to create some liquidity for those skill recognition. And what ACE has recently done is started to issue or allow the organizations whose courses and content they review to issue digital credentials with transparent competency-based information. So if you work at Walt Disney World and you do an apprenticeship there, or you work at Jiffy Lube and learn supervisory skills or customer service skills, you're in real time earning a credential that has immediate labor market value to both your current employer and to a potential future job, and you're banking credit that's transferable to a college institution who will accept ACE recommended credit. So the transparency, the role of employers beginning to play a much more visible role in acting as credentialing bodies, I think opens up a lot of opportunities for connecting and rebundling new kinds of pathways across industry and education.
Can I make one comment on that? I think one of the most exciting things about the registry is that the future of work, and as we all know, the future education is no longer you're done with learning at 21 and then you go have a job. The future is that we're going to be constantly needing to reskill and upskill. And so understanding if I need to learn something else to either get promoted or take a different job, where do I go get that credential, and what do I need to learn? I can go to the credential registry and say, this is the type of credential I need to get. Whether it's a badge or a micro master's or whatever it might be, and see what's available and what types of credentials are there, whether they're in my region or somewhere else, and have access to those, because that's where we're going. It's, the 17-year-old is a great example, but the future, it's not the 17-year-old. It's the 40-something-year-old, 50-year-old that is going to need to go get new learning and new credentials and new competencies.
I was going to say, we're doing it ourselves at AACRAO. We have 11,000 members who need professional development, and we do all kinds of training within our own profession on international credentials evaluation. As the world becomes more mobile, more universities need better trained people to evaluate credentials. We do training on enrollment management professionals. There will be a need for 750 of them in universities in the next 10 years. There aren't 750 ready today for that. So we're providing that training. We were talking with Jonathan's company about creating some badges for these, because how can we help our own professionals signal their readiness for that next level of employment, even within our own industry in higher education? So there's utility with this, even for people who already have lots of degrees, but really need those additional workforce skills and evidence of those skills in a way that they can readily transfer that information digitally to a prospective employer, or as a way to signal that they have accomplished something and might be ready for the next level of employment, even within their own organization.
Did you want to contribute that? Okay, great. Yes, so as the ecosystem, the learning ecosystem in the US is obviously not exactly the same as in the international market. You had mentioned that Credential Engine is thinking about going internationally. What are the things that it needs to do to evolve?
So the mandate from the very beginning, when Lumina Foundation, JP Morgan Chase, and the Business Roundtable all were the ones who kind of came together and said, this research endeavor that had been going on was good and was valuable, but if we're going to do this, we need to actually create a nonprofit to operationalize this. And our friends at the Business Roundtable were very clear, we hire in the US, and this information is critical here, but we hire all over the world, not only just to operate and work in other countries, but to bring them here and vice versa. So we have to have this information globally, and so our mission is to develop the registry here. We've developed the CTDL very consciously with an international framework in mind. It is already accessible through multiple languages, and we're beginning to have conversations both within North America, with Mexico and Canada. We're having very initial conversations with the EU and others about how does what we have in the CTDL now perfectly apply in description and coverage to other parts of the world. So we know that there'll have to be some adjustments. We know there'll have to be some growth, but we're looking forward to the opportunity to have those discussions so that we can have this be, because there is no other structure like this anyplace else. The EU has done done probably the most work in thinking about how do you classify, but not in the same way we've approached this. And so we think there's a lot of commonality and opportunity there. We have been working very closely from the beginning of last year with a number of other standards bodies. So if you're familiar with PESC, HR Open Standards, IMS Global, SEDS, and a handful of others, to make sure that the standards that we're putting together are aligned with and complementary to other standards in other parts of the ecosystem here. So that's our first step, and then we'll expand that to have conversations with standards bodies from around the world to make sure that what we're doing aligns with those other standards, which I think will make the evolution that much easier.
Yeah, and one thing, on the international front, I think one thing that we're reminded of when we think across national boundaries is the transparency helps a lot, and that credentials in many ways are very local. The kinds of credentials, especially that come from educational institutions, are often informed by local needs. But then there are credentials that have international recognition. Through our new partnership with Acclaim, more than, or at least half of the credential universe that Credly serves is across national boundaries. It's an international population with credentials that are recognized across the world in project management, in tech skills like Adobe Photoshop and Oracle and Cisco and IBM skills, for example. But we're also working with local partners. For example, City and Guilds is our partner in the UK and serving Europe to provide not only the support that's needed to help set up infrastructure and credentialing opportunities, but to actually do that relationship building that's important when you're introducing a new form of communication around credentials and also creating new credentials themselves. And so that's a really important partnership that's informing what it means to localize these kinds of offerings. And then just lastly, another really interesting and very new example is a group like the World Education Service, WES. World Education Services takes international degrees and provides a recommendation and an approval process that allows them to be consumed by US institutions and Canadian institutions, so that people here who might be not familiar with a school outside the country can validate that the program was a legitimate program, that the person completed it. And so those kinds of services around that sort of Rosetta Stone or translation services are not just language-based, they're also, I think, cultural. And I think the Credential Engine, by the way, is a really key part of all this, because we need to be able to look in a consistent way at credentials regardless of where they came from.
We're, AACRAO's a founding member of the Groningen Declaration. That meeting is going on right now in Paris. And that's the worldwide group of university systems that are working together to exchange records electronically. We're very lucky in the United States. We were the first ones to really do that. Back in the early 1990s, we started the electronic records exchange through AACRAO. It became PESC after some years, and now we're helping to work with Groningen. But we're just seeing this as an inevitable part of this, that we might start locally, might go national, but if we're not talking globally, we're probably missing alignment with key partners outside the United States.
Yeah, so we're at a global Silicon Valley conference. It's blockchain is one of the topics. I'm curious how that, what implications that may have on your area and particularly you, Tom, with AACRAO.
Yeah, so are we. That's a great question, and there's been a lot of buzz around distributed ledgers and blockchain and how it may be able to help us really in providing records. A couple of key concepts here that we're talking about. One is that lifelong records. If we're going to expand the amount of information a student can have from the educational experience through these new records, how do we ensure that they have access to it for life? Right now, if a student wants something, they call us up at the university and they get a transcript, right? And we verify they got the degree. If we're talking about these very deep, rich records with learning artifacts and evidence from e-portfolios and these type of things, well, how do we provide that for life? And how do we let the student control the access to that and take us out of the middle of it at the universities? And blockchain is one of those methods that we're looking at. There are a few experiments going on right now, but we're really at the experiment stage right now. But there are some universities experimenting with exchanging records through blockchain as a way to securely authenticate that what someone received was what someone sent.
Jonathan, you probably have a view on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, for us, Credly's one core part of our value proposition is to future-proof credentials for those who've earned them. And future-proofing means making sure they're accessible in whatever formats are needed for a given opportunity or a given purpose, and to make sure that regardless of their relationship and its longevity with the organization that issued those credentials, that the individual maintains access to them. So when a credential is in its earned state, in other words, somebody has actually achieved it, it's our responsibility and it's in our mission to make sure that those credentials are available in perpetuity. So one way to future-proof credentials is, for example, to offer it on the blockchain or on blockchains, as in the case with Credly. We don't pick winners as to which of these possible.
It might be helpful to explain what blockchains are. I think some of our audience may not be familiar.
Oh, okay.
You're the techie guy, so.
Sure. Well, it's funny you asked that question because I was actually talking to a reporter not too long ago and explaining what Credly is doing in the blockchain with a number of really interesting partners. And at the end of the conversation, she stepped back and said, "Isn't Credly kind of a blockchain? Because you provide independent verifiability of the skills and the achievements and the credentials people earned. You ensure that the transaction between an issuer and an earner is validated, and you facilitate that transaction. You ensure that it's secure and that it hasn't been tampered with, and that all the data that went into a credential at the time it has been issued matches at any future time when somebody looks at it." Like, yeah, we do that, we do that, we do that. I guess, yeah, we are kind of a blockchain. But a blockchain is, I think, the one difference between what I just listed as what a blockchain benefit affords. A blockchain is, as Tom said, a distributed ledger, meaning that you're storing the data and the fact that this transaction occurred across a set of disparate servers, essentially, so that you can ensure that the transaction matches up at every part of that chain.
Great, thank you.
I want to mention, different than Credly and AACRAO, Credential Engine is not actually tracking individuals or individual attainment of credentials. We are a registry of the credential information itself. So we will work with both of these organizations to make sure that when someone says, "I have this credential," they verify that they have the credential and it is future protected, but we will provide the information behind what that credential actually is and what's contained in it and the connections and everything else. So we do not want individual information for all the privacy protections and headaches that come with it. That's not what our role is. It's the role of lots of other organizations, whether it's AACRAO, Credly, LinkedIn, whoever else is out there. So we're not as actually concerned about blockchain for tracking information about credentials as others. We're a linked data set that will be pulling data from Purdue, Ivy Tech, University of Florida, whoever it may be, and they're making sure that they're protecting their data and sharing it with us. Someone wants to hack what a 2-year degree is, go for it. So we're not as quite worried about blockchain in our particular context.
Great. Courtney, with Lumina having been one of the original sponsors to create Credential Engine, and it's come a long way in a pretty short time, what do you see in the next 5 years would be the ideal? And I'd love to get other people's opinion as well. What would be the ideal scenario for this organization to be in 5 years?
In
Should
5
I be
years?
taking notes right now?
Maybe. So in 5 years, it would be, I mean, gosh, who knows what the credential landscape will be in 5 years? It changes so fast. So to be nimble enough to be able to capture new credentials as they emerge, to capture quality in a more expansive way. So, you know, with just over a year into this, there's a lot of information in there. But it would be nice if I were, just like I'm shopping for a car, how long does the car usually last? How much fuel, you know, how much money am I going to get from it when I sell it? So what is that value? And as a consumer of a credential, it would be nice to know if I get a credential from this place, I'm more likely to get a job at the end of it that makes this. And so having some of those outcome data with the credential, understanding that this is not I'm glad you said that, this is not student level data, and so to get that data is going to be difficult, especially if the provider is providing it. You want to make sure that it's valid and reliable data. But that's where I'd like to see it go, where the consumer has more information, or a provider has more information, an employer has more information about the quality pieces of that credential. The next phase would be even like, what is somebody like me, if I get a credential from this place or this place, where am I more likely to be successful? If we think about today and tomorrow's students, they're going to, be different ages, different race, ethnicities, different income levels, different needs. And so understanding if I get this credential for, if I am a 50-something African-American male, what is that going to provide for me getting that credential versus this credential? And so that would be amazing in 5 years to be there, but thinking about how do we better support today and tomorrow's students, I think that's the best way to do it.
Jonathan, from your perspective?
I agree with the notion that 5 years it seems like forever. But I think one of the things that we'll see is the results of having had that kind of data, right? And new kinds of data inside the registry. I think one of the fastest growing areas is workforce-based information. If you spend 95% of your life, your learning life in the workplace, not in a formal learning environment, the credentials that actually emerge from on-the-job performance, I think, will grow. And I think it'll also become a beacon and a signal for what kinds of companies and organizations are the kinds of places people want to work, because they represent a place you can go for lifelong learning. You're not going to wind up in a job and find that within 6 months, a year, 3 years, not only have you no opportunity to be promoted within that organization, but that your skills are outdated and you can't even move laterally or into another organization. So companies are increasingly recognizing that to attract the best talent, they have to project that they're a kind of organization that values upskilling, and that means transparently showcasing what those outcomes look like, getting them published in the form of digital credentials and badges, and getting them into the engine. So I imagine we'll see a tipping point of more company-based information and not just industry certifications in higher ed in there.
Great.
Tom, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I like the tipping point notion of this, and we used to say that higher education moves at glacial speed, but glaciers are moving pretty fast these days. So, I would settle.
It's also disappearing, so I'm not sure that's the right analogy.
Yeah. I would hope that maybe somewhere around 60% of higher education institutions have identified their learning outcomes and therefore put them in to the Credential Engine. Because once we reach that, the rest will come. That tipping point, you hit it, people will follow towards that end. So I'd be very pleased with that outcome in 5 years.
Scott?
Well, I'm going to agree with everything except be a little bit more aggressive than Tom. I think in the world, I think this is coming. I think there is no stopping, this next generation of students who are going to be shocked that they can have more information about buying a used car than they can about what they can get in the credential marketplace. So I just think this is going to happen. I think we need to push very hard, and I think we can get to, 200, 250,000 credentials in the next couple of years. I think that is very doable, and I think we're going to get there. I'm going to be a little nerdy, perhaps. It's usually not my forte. But to get there, really what happens, when you think about this, when you go onto Expedia and you're searching for hotels, you're getting the data directly from the Marriott website, right? Marriott has actually marked up their data about their hotels so that it can be pulled into central registries like Expedia. But you could also just do a Google search and go straight to Marriott in San Diego and get the data right there. So ultimately, the real goal here is to get San Diego State University to not just share their data with us, but to mark their data up on their website so anyone can go search San Diego State University. So really the goal is to have a cultural IT transformation in the entire education and training marketplace, so that it's not dependent upon us to go find their learning outcome data, map it into the registry, get it in, and then share it out. It's to get the system directly at the source to transform their data so that it is transparent and searchable right from the source. That is the more transformational goal, and if we're successful, we'll help to move that piece of the market forward and have that data be accessible right away. It's a little nerdier than I get, but it's an important point to make, is what we're really trying to get to.
So that's a great way to end it. We'll open up to questions if anybody has any questions. Go ahead, please.
University Australia, good customer of Credly, by the way. I can't agree with you more, Scott, and I'm going to make a plea for Go Global. Deakin University has at least 6 degrees available on the Future Learning platform, UK-based. We've seen degrees on Coursera and others. The need is absolutely urgent because our students are doing degrees from all over the world, not just travelling, but they're now doing them digitally.
Right.
So to be a global and inclusive, even the Southern Hemisphere, if I may suggest. Don't forget us when you're connecting. It's also working with groups like Lumina as well, because it's getting the degree requirements, frameworks, timelines joined up across even the English-speaking world to start with. We're learning a lot of lessons about pricing, value, cost, international mobility. So I'm just putting in a plea for think really global, please.
Yeah.
And I will say that Australia has probably been the country that we've gotten the most inquiries from about how do we partner. So we're.
Probably me.
I didn't want to call you out by name. Feeling a little stalked, but fine. We're getting ready. We feel like we have to really get ourselves established and off and running here. But yes.
Great. Well, we unfortunately are out of time. Please thank our panelists, and feel free to ask them questions as follow-ups.